You walk into meetings feeling like you have to prove your worth to people who seem indifferent to your presence. Every networking event becomes an exhausting performance where you second-guess every word, wondering if you're saying the right thing to make people like you, while others effortlessly command attention and genuine affection from everyone they meet. I am Dale Carnegie, and I spent decades studying human nature, teaching millions of people how to win friends and influence others through genuine connection rather than desperate performance. What I discovered about human psychology will transform how you approach every relationship, giving you the secret to making people genuinely enjoy your company from the very first moment they meet you. The principles I'll share aren't about manipulation or fake charm. They're about understanding the fundamental human desires that, when honored, create instant rapport and lasting friendship. But first, like this video, subscribe for more relationship wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready for genuine connection. I want you to understand something about me wasn't born with natural charm or social grace. In fact, I was quite the opposite. Growing up on a farm in Maryville, Missouri, in the 1880s, I was painfully shy, awkward around people, and desperately wanted to be liked, but had no idea how to make it happen. My father was a poor farmer, and we struggled to make ends meet, while other children seemed to effortlessly make friends and command attention. I stood on the sidelines, watching and wondering what secret they possessed that I lacked. I remember writing in my childhood diary a simple notebook where I recorded my daily observations about how certain people could walk into our one-room schoolhouse and immediately become the center of positive attention, while others, like me, seemed invisible or worse, actively avoided. What fascinated me even then was that the popular children weren't necessarily the smartest or the most attractive. There was something else at work. Something in how they treated others, how they made people feel. I started noting these patterns in my diary, though I didn't understand their significance at the time. My family's financial struggles meant I couldn't attend college immediately, so I tried my hand at various jobs, teaching, selling correspondence courses, even acting. Each failure taught me something valuable about human nature. When I failed as a salesman, it wasn't because I didn't know the product. It was because I didn't know how to connect with people. When I struggled as a teacher, it wasn't because one lacked knowledge. It was because I couldn't inspire my students to want to learn. The turning point came when I moved to New York City in 1912. Broke and desperate, I convinced the YMCA to let me teach a public speaking course. Not because I was a great speaker, I was terrified of public speaking myself, but because I promised to split the profits with them. That first class changed everything. In that small room filled with equally terrified adults, I discovered something remarkable. As I watched these people struggle with the same fears and insecurities I had battled my entire life, I realized that the key to being liked wasn't about becoming someone different. It was about helping others become the best version of themselves. When I focused on making my students feel capable, confident, and appreciated, something magical happened. They didn't just learn to speak better, they began to like me genuinely. And more importantly, they began to like themselves. This revelation led me to study human psychology with an intensity that bordered on obsession. I read every book I could find on the subject. But more importantly, I observed people constantly. I watched how successful individuals interacted with others, how they made people feel, what they did differently from those who struggled socially. Through years of teaching and observation, I developed what would become my life's work, systematic understanding of human relations, based not on manipulation or artificial techniques, but on genuine principles that honor the fundamental human desire to feel valued, understood, and appreciated. The moment that changed everything for me came during my third year of teaching at the YMCA. I had a student named Charles, a middle-aged accountant who was so shy he could barely whisper his name during introductions. Week after week, he sat in the back row, trembling whenever I called on him, his voice barely audible when he attempted to speak. Most instructors would have written Charles off as hopeless, but something about his determination touched me. Despite his terror, he showed up every week, sitting in that same back row seat, fighting his fears. One evening, after a particularly difficult session where Charles had struggled through a 2-minute speech about his hobby of stamp collecting, I made a decision that would revolutionize my understanding of human nature. Instead of focusing on what Charles had done wrong, his shaking hands, his stammering voice, his obvious nervousness, chose to find something genuine to appreciate. After class, I approached him privately and said, "Charles, I want you to know that your passion for stamp collecting really came through tonight. When you described that rare 1918 inverted Jenny stamp, your eyes lit up, and for a moment, you forgot to be nervous. That's the real speaker inside you." The transformation was immediate and profound. Charles's entire posture changed. His shoulders straightened, his eyes brightened, and for the first time since I'd known him, he smiled, genuinely. But what happened next was even more remarkable. The following week, Charles arrived early, sat in the front row, and delivered a speech about his stamp collection that was not only confident, but genuinely engaging. This experience led me to a revelation that would become the cornerstone of everything I taught. Every human being has a deep, driving desire to feel important, to feel appreciated, to feel valued. This isn't vanity or selfishness, it's a fundamental human need, as basic as the need for food or shelter. I began experimenting with this principle in all my interactions. When I met John D. Rockefeller Jr. at a business function, instead of trying to impress him with my accomplishments, I asked him about his philanthropic work and listened with genuine interest as he described his passion for education. The conversation lasted an hour, and afterward, he wrote me a letter saying it was one of the most meaningful discussions he'd had in months. The secret wasn't flattery. People can detect insincere praise from miles away. The secret was finding something genuine to appreciate in every person I met. Everyone, without exception, has something praiseworthy about them. It might be their dedication to their work, their love for their family, their unique perspective on life, or even their courage in facing difficulties. I discovered that when you give people honest appreciation for something they genuinely value about themselves, you unlock something powerful. They don't just like you, they come alive in your presence. They become more confident, more engaging, more willing to share their best selves with you. This principle transformed not only my teaching, but every relationship in my life. I went from being the shy farm boy desperate for acceptance to someone people sought out, not because I was the most interesting person in the room, but because I made them feel like they were. After discovering the power of appreciation, I faced a troubling realization. Some people were trying to use my techniques as manipulation tactics. They would offer fake compliments and forced interest, wondering why they weren't getting the results I described. This led me to understand something crucial: the difference between genuine interest and calculated performance. Let me share with you a story that illustrates this difference perfectly. I once had the opportunity to meet Theodore Roosevelt at a dinner party in New York. Like many people meeting a former president, I was nervous and wanted to make a good impression. My first instinct was to talk about my work, my accomplishments, my ideas about public speaking, anything to seem impressive and worthy of his attention. But then I remembered my own principle. Instead of trying to impress Roosevelt, I decided to become genuinely interested in him as a person. Before the dinner, I did something unusual. I researched not his political achievements, which everyone knew, but his personal passions. I discovered he was an avid naturalist with a particular fascination for birds. When I met him, instead of launching into my own agenda, I asked him about his birdwatching experiences. His face immediately lit up. For the next 30 minutes, this former president of the United States talked enthusiastically about the rare species he'd observed, his expeditions, and his theories about bird migration patterns. He spoke with such passion and knowledge that I found myself genuinely fascinated, asking follow-up questions not to impress him, but because I was truly curious about his experiences. At the end of our conversation, Roosevelt told several people that I was one of the most interesting people he'd met in years. The irony was perfect. I had become interesting to him. By being interested in him, this experience taught me the fundamental difference between authentic interest and social manipulation. When your interest is genuine, it flows naturally. You ask questions because you truly want to know the answers. You listen because you're actually curious about what the person is saying. You remember details because they matter to you, not because you're trying to score points. Genuine interest cannot be faked for long because it requires emotional investment. When I was truly interested in Roosevelt's birdwatching, I wasn't performing, I was connecting. I learned things I never would have discovered otherwise, and he felt the rare pleasure of sharing his passion with someone who appreciated it. I began applying this principle systematically in my classes and personal life. When I met new students, instead of immediately assessing their speaking abilities, I would spend time learning about their lives, their work, their interests, their dreams. I discovered that a shy banker was also a gifted amateur musician, that a nervous secretary was passionate about medieval history, that a stammering engineer had fascinating theories about bridge design. The more I learned about people as individuals, rather than just students, the more they opened up to me. They weren't just more willing to learn. They were eager to share their best efforts because they felt understood and valued as complete human beings. This principle works because it addresses a fundamental human truth. Everyone wants to feel seen and understood. When you take genuine interest in someone's life, experiences, and thoughts, you give them a rare gift. In a world where most people are waiting for their turn to speak, the person who listens with authentic curiosity stands out dramatically. But remember, this must be genuine. People can sense the difference between someone who is truly interested in them and someone who is performing interest to achieve a goal. Authentic interest comes from a place of respect and curiosity about the human experience in all its forms. I'll confess something embarrassing. I was terrible with names. Absolutely terrible. I would meet someone at a party, engage in a wonderful conversation, and then 5 minutes later, I couldn't remember their name to save my life. This was more than just socially awkward. It was professionally devastating for someone trying to teach human relations. The problem came to a head during one of my early classes when I called a student by the wrong name 3 weeks in a row. The man's name was Frederick Williamson, but I kept calling him William Frederick. I could see the slight wince each time I got it wrong, and finally, he corrected me gently but firmly. The embarrassment I felt was nothing compared to the realization of what I had been doing. I was making someone feel unimportant and unrecognized in the very class where I was supposed to be teaching people how to connect with others. That night, I developed what I came to call my name system. I created small cards for each person I met, writing not just their name, but also key details about them, their profession, their interests, their family situation, anything that would help me remember them as a complete person. But more importantly, I began to understand why names matter so much. A person's name is to them the sweetest and most important sound in any language. It represents their identity, their individuality, their very existence. When you remember and use someone's name, you acknowledge their importance as a unique human being. When you forget or mispronounce it, you diminish them, even if unintentionally. I started experimenting with the power of names in my daily interactions. When I went to my regular coffee shop, instead of just ordering my coffee, I made an effort to learn the server's name and use it. "Good morning, Martha. How are you today?" The transformation was immediate. Martha's whole demeanor changed. She smiled more genuinely, took extra care with my order, and began greeting me warmly each morning. The same principle worked in my professional life. When I remembered the names of janitors, secretaries, and other people whom many professionals overlooked, I found doors opening that had been closed before. These individuals often had more influence than people realized, and they remembered kindness. I discovered that using someone's name correctly isn't just about politeness, it's about recognition of their humanity. In my classes, when I made the effort to learn every student's name quickly and use their names frequently during discussions, the entire atmosphere changed. Students participated more, engaged more deeply, and felt more connected to the learning process. But I learned there's a technique to using names effectively. It's not enough to just remember them. You need to use them naturally in conversation. When someone makes a good point in a discussion, saying "That's an excellent insight, Robert," has much more impact than just saying "That's an excellent insight." When you greet someone, "Hello, Susan. It's wonderful to see you," feels warmer and more personal than a generic greeting. I so discovered the importance of getting names right. If someone's name is difficult to pronounce, I learned to ask them to help me say it correctly and to practice until I got it right. The effort itself communicates respect and genuine interest in the person. The psychological impact of hearing your own name spoken with warmth and respect cannot be overstated. It triggers a positive response that makes people more receptive to you and more likely to remember you fondly. In a world where people often feel anonymous and unrecognized, the simple act of remembering and using someone's name makes you stand out as someone who truly sees them. This principle became so central to my teaching that I would tell my students, if you want to make a good impression on someone, start by making an effort to remember their name. It's often the first gift you can give them in any relationship. Perhaps the most counterintuitive discovery I made about winning friends was this: the secret to being interesting is to be interested. Most people believe that to be liked, they need to be fascinating speakers, witty conversationalists, or entertaining storytellers. I believed this too, until an experience at a dinner party completely changed my perspective. I was seated next to a distinguished-looking gentleman who, I learned, was a renowned botanist just returned from an expedition to South America. My first instinct was to try to impress him with stories from my own travels and experiences, but something made me pause. Perhaps it was his slightly weary expression that suggested he had endured many such conversations with people eager to share their own tales. Instead, I asked him about his expedition. What I intended as polite interest became genuine fascination as he described discovering new species of orchids in the Amazon rainforest. For the next 2 hours, I spoke perhaps 10% of the time, asking questions and listening intently, as he shared stories of navigating treacherous rivers, negotiating with indigenous tribes, and the breathtaking moment of finding a flower no human had ever catalogued before. At the end of the evening, he took my hand warmly and said, "Mr. Carnegie, I cannot tell you how refreshing it was to meet someone truly interested in botanical work. Most people find it dreadfully boring." Several other guests later told me they had never seen him so animated and engaging. The irony was perfect. By saying little, I had become the most memorable person at the dinner for him. This experience led me to study the conversation patterns of socially successful people, and I made a startling discovery. The most popular individuals weren't necessarily the best speakers, they were the best listeners. They had mastered the art of making others feel heard and understood. I began experimenting with this principle in my classes. Instead of dominating discussions with my own insights, I started asking more questions and creating space for students to share their experiences. The transformation was remarkable. Class participation increased dramatically, students became more engaged, and the quality of discussions improved significantly. But I learned that effective listening is much more than simply staying quiet while someone talks. It requires active engagement. I developed what I called empathetic listening, truly trying to understand not just what someone was saying, but how they felt about what they were saying. When a student shared a personal story about overcoming fear, I didn't just wait for them to finish so I could add my own insights. Instead, I listened for the emotion behind their words, asked follow-up questions that showed I understood the significance of their experience, and reflected back what I heard in a way that validated their feelings. The results were extraordinary. People began seeking me out for conversations. Business acquaintances started inviting me to lunch, not because I was entertaining them with brilliant stories, but because they left our conversations feeling understood and valued. I discovered that most people are starving for someone to truly listen to them. In their daily lives, they encounter people who are waiting for their turn to speak, people who are distracted by their own thoughts, people who listen only long enough to find an opening to share their own experiences. When you give someone the gift of complete attention, when you listen not just to respond but to understand, you provide something rare and precious. The technique is simple but requires discipline. When someone is speaking, focus entirely on them. Don't plan your response. Don't judge their words. Don't let your mind wander to your own similar experiences. Listen with curiosity and empathy. Ask clarifying questions, and show through your responses that you genuinely understand what they've shared. This principle works because it fulfills a fundamental human need, the need to be heard and understood. When you become known as someone who truly listens, people will be drawn to you in ways that no amount of clever conversation could achieve. Every human being, without exception, wants to feel important. This isn't vanity or selfishness. As fundamental to human nature as the need for food, shelter, or safety. Understanding this principle and learning to fulfill this need in others transformed me from someone who desperately sought importance for himself into someone others naturally gravitated toward. The revelation came to me through observing the behavior of a janitor at the YMCA where I taught. His name was Samuel, and every evening he would clean our classroom with meticulous care. Most instructors barely acknowledged his presence, treating him as part of the furniture. But I noticed something remarkable about Samuel. He took genuine pride in his work, arranging chairs perfectly, ensuring every surface gleamed, even organizing my materials more efficiently than I had left them. One evening, instead of rushing past him as usual, I stopped and said, "Samuel, I want you to know that your work makes such a difference in my classes. When students walk into a perfectly organized, spotless room, it sets a tone of respect and professionalism that helps them learn better. You're not just cleaning, you're contributing to their success." Samuel stopped his work, looked at me with surprise, and then broke into the widest smile I had ever seen from him. From that day forward, our classroom received special attention. Samuel would often stay a few extra minutes to ensure everything was perfect, and he began offering suggestions for room arrangement that actually improved my teaching effectiveness. This interaction taught me something profound. Everyone has a role that matters, and when you acknowledge that importance genuinely, you unlock their best efforts and their loyalty. I began looking for opportunities to make people feel important in authentic ways. When I noticed a shy student making a particularly insightful comment, I would acknowledge it specifically. "Margaret, that observation about stage fright affecting physical posture is exactly what professional speakers need to understand. You've identified something crucial." Margaret, who had barely spoken in previous classes, began contributing regularly, and eventually became one of my most confident speakers. The key distinction I learned was between empty flattery and genuine appreciation of someone's importance. Flattery is insincere praise designed to manipulate. Making someone feel important is recognizing and acknowledging their real value, their actual contributions, their unique qualities. I developed a practice of looking for each person's area of expertise or passion and acknowledging it. The accountant who was passionate about medieval history, the secretary who had innovative ideas about office efficiency, the engineer who wrote poetry in his spare time. Everyone had something that made them special, something that was genuinely important to them. When I met successful business leaders, instead of trying to impress them with my accomplishments, I would find ways to acknowledge their expertise and contributions. I once spent an entire lunch conversation with a successful manufacturer, asking him about his innovations in production efficiency. He later told colleagues it was one of the most stimulating conversations he'd had about his work, even though I had contributed very little beyond thoughtful questions and genuine appreciation for his insights. The psychological principle at work is simple but powerful. When you make someone feel important, they associate those positive feelings with you. They don't just like youth, they feel better about themselves when they're around you. You become someone who enhances their sense of self-worth rather than threatening it. I discovered that making people feel important is most effective when it's specific and authentic. Instead of saying you're wonderful, say your ability to explain complex financial concepts in simple terms is remarkably. Have a real gift for teaching. Instead of great job, say the way you handled that difficult customer showed real professionalism and emotional intelligence. This principle works in every context: professional relationships, family interactions, casual encounters. When you consistently look for ways to acknowledge people's importance, contributions, and unique qualities, you become the kind of person others seek out. They don't just enjoy your company, they feel more confident and valued because of it. The beautiful irony is that by focusing on making others feel important rather than trying to prove your own importance, you become genuinely important to them. People remember and value those who make them feel good about themselves. One of the most valuable skills I developed was the ability to find common ground with virtually anyone I met, regardless of our apparent differences in background, profession, or social status. This skill often meant the difference between a polite but forgettable conversation and the beginning of a meaningful relationship. I learned this lesson dramatically during a speaking engagement in Chicago. I was to have dinner with a gruff steel mill foreman named Patrick O'Malley before my presentation to his company's management team. On the surface, we had nothing in common. He was a tough, no-nonsense industrial worker with calloused hands and a suspicious attitude toward fancy speakers from New York. I was nervous about connecting with him. Rather than trying to impress him with my credentials or expertise, I decided to find something we genuinely shared. During our conversation, I discovered that both of us had grown up on farms, though his was in Ireland and mine in Missouri. That single commonality opened the floodgates. For the next hour, we shared stories about farm life, the early morning chores, the stubborn animals, the satisfaction of hard physical work, the way farm life teaches you resilience and practical problem solving. Patrick's entire demeanor changed. His suspicion melted away, replaced by warmth and genuine engagement. By the end of dinner, he was telling everyone that I was a regular fellow who understood real work. This experience taught me that no matter how different two people may appear on the surface, there are always points of connection if you look for them. The key is to approach each new person with curiosity rather than judgment, looking for shared experiences, values, or interests rather than focusing on differences. I began developing what I called my commonality radar. When meeting someone new, I would listen carefully for clues about their background, interests, challenges, or values that might overlap with my own experiences. Sometimes the connection was obvious: shared hometowns, similar professions, or common interests. But often it was more subtle: shared struggles with public speaking, similar experiences raising children, or parallel challenges in business. During my travels, I met people from vastly different cultures and backgrounds. In London, I connected with a reserved British banker over our mutual appreciation for American literature. In a small town in Kansas, I found common ground with a local farmer through our shared experience of economic uncertainty. In each case, finding that point of connection transformed the interaction from polite formality to genuine human connection. I learned that the most powerful common ground often comes from shared struggles or challenges rather than shared successes. When I met other business owners, we might connect over the difficulties of managing employees or the stress of financial uncertainty. When I spoke with parents, we bonded over the challenges and joys of raising children. These shared struggles created immediate empathy and understanding. The technique requires genuine curiosity and careful listening. You can't force commonalities or manufacture shared experiences, but almost everyone has faced challenges, pursued dreams, experienced loss, celebrated victories, or struggled with fears. When you listen with empathy, you'll often discover these shared human experiences. I also learned to share appropriately from my own experience when I found common ground. If someone mentioned struggling with stage fright, I would share my own early terror of public speaking. If they talked about growing up poor, I could relate my own family's financial struggles. These shared vulnerabilities created instant bonds of understanding. Finding common ground works because it transforms strangers into fellow travelers. Instead of seeing someone as fundamentally different or foreign, you begin to see them as someone who has walked similar paths, faced similar challenges, or shared similar dreams. This recognition of our shared humanity breaks down barriers and creates the foundation for genuine relationship. The beauty of this principle is that it's authentic. You're not pretending to have things in common. You're discovering the connections that actually exist. Every person you meet is a complex individual with a rich life experience, and if you approach them with genuine curiosity and openness, you'll almost always find points where your lives have intersected in meaningful ways. I must admit, smiling didn't come naturally to me. Growing up on that Missouri farm, facing financial hardship and social awkwardness, I developed what my mother called a serious countenance. I thought this made me appear intelligent and professional, but I learned it was actually creating a barrier between me and the very people I wanted to connect with. The lesson came through an embarrassing revelation. After one of my early classes, a student approached me and said, "Mr. Carnegie, your teaching is excellent, but you seem so stern and unapproachable. I was afraid to ask questions because you looked like you might be annoyed by them." That comment hit me like a physical blow. Here I was, trying to teach people how to connect with others, and my own expression was pushing them away. That night, I stood in front of my mirror and practiced smiling. It felt forced and artificial at first, like I was putting on a mask, but gradually I began to understand the difference between a manufactured smile and a genuine one. A real smile isn't just about moving your mouth, it engages your entire face, especially your eyes. It comes from a place of warmth and genuine pleasure in connecting with another person. I decided to experiment with the power of a genuine smile in my daily interactions. The first test was with Mrs. Peterson, the stern landlady of my boarding house. She was known for her cold efficiency and rarely acknowledged tenants beyond collecting rent. The next morning, instead of hurrying past her with a quick nod, I stopped, smiled warmly, and said, "Good morning, Mrs. Peterson. I hope you're having a wonderful day." The transformation was immediate and startling. Her entire face softened. She smiled back genuinely, and she actually asked how my classes were going. From that day forward, our relationship completely changed. She began going out of her way to help me, saving me the best portions at dinner, and even reducing my rent. When I mentioned financial pressures, this experience led me to study the psychological impact of smiling. I discovered that a genuine smile communicates several powerful messages simultaneously: approachability, warmth, confidence, and positive intention. When you smile at someone, you're essentially saying, "I'm glad to see you. I'm safe to approach. I wish you well." But I learned that the smile must be authentic. People can instinctively detect the difference between a genuine smile and a forced one. A genuine smile comes from actually feeling pleasure or warmth toward the person you're greeting. This means you need to cultivate genuine goodwill toward others. You need to actually be glad to see them. I developed a mental practice that helped me generate authentic smiles. Before entering any room or approaching any person, I would take a moment to remind myself that I was about to meet a fellow human being with their own hopes, struggles, and dreams. I would consciously choose to be genuinely pleased about the opportunity to connect with them. This mental shift naturally produced the kind of smile that opened doors. The impact of this change was remarkable. Students began staying after class to ask questions and share personal challenges. Business colleagues started inviting me to lunch and including me in important discussions. Strangers on the street would return my smile and often strike up conversations. I discovered that smiling is contagious in the most positive way. When you smile genuinely at someone, they almost always smile back, and that creates a positive feedback loop. Both people end up feeling better, more connected, and more open to each other. But perhaps the most important discovery was that smiling changed how I felt, not just how others perceived me. When I made a conscious effort to smile more often, I actually became a happier, more optimistic person. The physical act of smiling seemed to trigger positive emotions, creating an upward spiral of genuine warmth and happiness. I began teaching my students that a smile is one of the most powerful tools they could develop. It costs nothing, requires no special training, and yet it can transform any interaction. A genuine smile can turn a hostile encounter into a friendly one, a business transaction into a relationship, a stranger into a potential friend. The key is authenticity. You cannot fake genuine warmth for long, so the real work is developing genuine appreciation and goodwill toward others. When you truly care about people's well-being and genuinely enjoy human connection, the smile becomes natural and irresistible. One of the most counterintuitive lessons I learned about winning people over was the power of admitting my mistakes quickly and emphatically. For most of my early life, I believed that admitting errors would make me appear weak, incompetent, or untrustworthy. I couldn't have been more wrong. The lesson came through a painful but illuminating experience with one of my classes. I had been teaching a particular principle about voice projection for several weeks, insisting that students should speak from their diaphragm in a specific way. A student named Dr. Harrison, who was an experienced physician, gently suggested that my anatomical explanation was incorrect. My first instinct was to defend my position, to find ways to justify what I had taught rather than admit error. But something made me pause. I looked at Dr. Harrison's kind but certain expression, and I realized I had a choice. I could stubbornly defend an incorrect position and damage my credibility, or I could admit my mistake and learn something valuable. I took a deep breath and said, "Dr. Harrison, you're absolutely right, and I apologize for the confusion I've caused. Would you be willing to share the correct explanation with the class?" What happened next astonished me. Instead of losing respect, I gained it. The entire class seemed to relax, as if they had been holding their breath, waiting to see how I would handle being corrected. Dr. Harrison graciously explained the correct anatomy, Several other students shared their own expertise in their fields, and the class became more collaborative and engaging than it had ever been. This experience taught me that admitting mistakes quickly and sincerely accomplishes several powerful things simultaneously. First, it disarms potential criticism by removing the critic's ammunition. You can't attack someone who has already acknowledged their error. Second, it demonstrates honesty and humility, which actually increases rather than decreases trust. Third, it models the kind of openness that encourages others to be honest with you. I began experimenting with this principle in various situations. When I made an error in scheduling and double-booked myself for speaking engagements, instead of making excuses or trying to shift blame, I immediately contacted both parties, admitted my mistake fully, and worked diligently to find solutions. In both cases, the clients were not only understanding but impressed with my honesty and effort to make things right. The key to making this principle work is speed and sincerity. The longer you wait to admit a mistake, the more defensive you appear when you finally acknowledge it. But when you admit errors quickly, before others have even raised them as issues, you demonstrate integrity and self-awareness that people find refreshing and trustworthy. I also learned that the way you admit mistakes matters enormously. A grudging acknowledgement that sounds like an excuse actually makes things worse. But a full, sincere admission that takes complete responsibility creates instant respect. Instead of saying, "I may have been wrong about that," I learned to say, "I was completely wrong about that, and I apologize for any confusion I caused." Perhaps most importantly, I discovered that admitting mistakes creates opportunities for deeper relationships. When you show vulnerability and humanity by acknowledging your errors, you give others permission to be human too. This mutual acknowledgement of imperfection often leads to more genuine, less guarded interactions. In my business relationships, I found that clients and colleagues began trusting me more when they saw that I could admit mistakes honestly. They knew that if I said something was going well, I meant it, because they had seen that I was willing to acknowledge when things weren't going well. The principle also taught me to become more careful and thoughtful, not because I was afraid of making mistakes, but because I knew I would have to own them completely. This actually improved my performance while simultaneously making me more likable and trustworthy. I began teaching my students that everyone makes mistakes, but not everyone has the courage and wisdom to admit them quickly and sincerely. Those who do develop a reputation for integrity that serves them well throughout their lives. People would rather work with someone who makes occasional mistakes but owns them honestly than with someone who appears perfect but is actually defensive and unreliable. The ultimate irony is that by freely admitting my imperfections, I became someone people viewed as more competent and trustworthy, not less. I used to love arguing. In my younger days, I prided myself on my ability to debate, to marshal facts and logic, to prove my point and demolish my opponent's position. I thought this made me appear intelligent and knowledgeable. It took me years to realize that this approach was actually pushing people away and damaging relationships I valued. The revelation came during a dinner party where I found myself in a heated debate with a successful businessman about economic policy. I had done my research, had all my facts lined up, and systematically dismantled every point he made. By the end of the evening, I had clearly won the argument from a logical standpoint, but I had lost something far more valuably, had embarrassed him in front of his peers and created an enemy where I could have made a friend. Later that week, I learned that this man had significant influence in circles where I hoped to expand my speaking career. My victory in that argument had cost me potential opportunities and professional relationships. That's when I began to understand a fundamental truth. You cannot win an argument. If you lose, you lose. If you win, you still lose, because you've made the other person feel foolish, hurt their pride, and damaged your relationship with them. I started studying my own behavior in disagreements and noticed a pattern that disturbed me. When someone contradicted me, my immediate impulse was to defend my position rather than understand theirs. I was so focused on being right that I wasn't actually listening to what the other person was saying. I was just waiting for my turn to speak, planning my counterattack while they presented their views. This realization led me to develop what I called the diplomatic approach to disagreements. Instead of immediately opposing someone's viewpoint, I began looking for areas where I could honestly agree with them. This wasn't about being dishonest or abandoning my principles. It was about finding common ground before exploring differences. I remember a particularly challenging situation with a business partner who wanted to change our marketing approach in a way I thought was completely wrong. My old approach would have been to immediately explain why his idea wouldn't work. Instead, I said, "You're absolutely right that our current marketing isn't reaching everyone we want to reach. I share your concern about expanding our audience." By starting with agreement, I had established that we were on the same side, working toward the same goal. From that foundation, we could explore different approaches without either of us feeling attacked or defensive. The conversation that followed was collaborative rather than combative, and we actually developed a marketing strategy that was better than either of our original ideas. I learned that most disagreements aren't really about the facts, they're about ego and the need to feel respected and heard. When you immediately contradict someone, you're essentially telling them they're stupid or wrong, which triggers their defensive instincts. But when you start by acknowledging their valid concerns or insights, you create space for productive dialogue. The technique I developed was simple but powerful. Before expressing any disagreement, I would find something in the other person's position that I could genuinely agree with or appreciate. This might be their underlying concern, their good intentions, their valid observations, or their right to hold their opinion. I discovered that this approach often led to surprising outcomes. People who felt heard and respected were much more open to considering alternative viewpoints. Sometimes they would even modify their positions without me having to argue against them at all. Other times, I found that their perspectives had merit I hadn't initially recognized. This principle transformed not only my professional relationships, but my personal ones as well. Instead of creating tension and conflict, I became known as someone who could discuss difficult topics constructively. People began seeking my input on challenging situations because they knew I wouldn't make them feel foolish or attacked. The ultimate lesson was that true influence comes not from winning arguments, but from understanding people and finding ways to work together toward shared goals. One of my most humbling lessons in human relations came when I realized how dismissive I had been of other people's opinions, particularly those that differed significantly from my own. The wake-up call came through a student named Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, an elderly woman in one of my public speaking classes. Mrs. Whitman held strong views about women's roles in society that were quite traditional and, frankly, very different from the more progressive ideas I had embraced. During a class discussion about choosing speech topics, she mentioned wanting to speak about the importance of women focusing on home and family rather than careers. I could feel my immediate internal resistance to her viewpoint, and I'm afraid my expression showed it. Instead of encouraging her, as I would any other student, I suggested she might want to consider a less controversial topic that would be more universally appealing. The hurt in her eyes was unmistakable. She quietly nodded and changed her topic, but I could see that I had done something far worse than disagree with her, had dismissed her right to hold and express her opinion. That evening, I reflected on what had happened and realized I had violated one of the fundamental principles I was trying to teach. I had failed to respect another person's dignity and their right to their own thoughts and beliefs. The next week, I approached Mrs. Whitman privately and said, "I owe you an apology. Your opinion about women's roles is valid and important, and you have every right to speak about what matters to you. I was wrong to suggest you change your topic." Her response taught me something profound. She said, "Mr. Carnegie, I don't need you to agree with my views, but I did need you to respect my right to hold them. When you dismissed my topic, you dismissed me as a person." She went on to give one of the most passionate and well-reasoned speeches of the entire course about her beliefs, and while I still disagreed with much of what she said, I gained enormous respect for her conviction and thoughtfulness. This experience led me to develop what I called the respectful disagreement approach. I learned to separate my evaluation of an idea from my respect for the person holding it. Someone could have opinions I strongly opposed while still deserving my respect as a thinking, feeling human being with their own experiences and reasoning. I began practicing phrases that acknowledge this respect, even when I disagreed. "I can see why you would think that. That's an interesting perspective I hadn't considered. I respect your right to that opinion, even though I see it differently. And you may be right about that. I hadn't thought of it from that angle." The transformation in my relationships was remarkable. People became much more open to hearing my viewpoints when they felt their own were respected. Instead of defensive arguments, we had productive discussions. Instead of trying to demolish each other's positions, we explored different perspectives. With curiosity, I discovered that showing respect for others' opinions doesn't mean agreeing with them or abandoning your own principles. It means acknowledging that reasonable people can look at the same situation and reach different conclusions based on their experiences, values, and reasoning. This acknowledgement creates space for genuine dialogue rather than combat. The technique proved especially valuable in business situations where people held strong but different opinions about strategy, goals, or methods. By starting any disagreement with genuine respect for the other person's viewpoint, I could explore differences constructively rather than defensively. I also learned that respecting others' opinions often led them to modify or refine their positions voluntarily. When people don't feel attacked or dismissed, they're more willing to consider alternative perspectives and even acknowledge flaws in their own reasoning. Perhaps most importantly, I realized that showing respect for others' opinions was really about showing respect for their humanity. Everyone's opinions are shaped by their unique life experiences, education, and circumstances. When you dismiss someone's opinion cavalierly, you're implicitly dismissing the experiences and reasoning that led them to that conclusion. This principle taught me intellectual humility, the recognition that I might be wrong, that others might see something I'm missing, and that truth often emerges through respectful exchange of different viewpoints rather than through one person overwhelming another with superior argument. The result was that people began to trust me with their real thoughts and feelings, knowing I wouldn't attack or belittle them for thinking differently than I did. Building on my earlier discovery about admitting mistakes, I learned that the speed and manner of admission could make the difference between damaging a relationship and actually strengthening it. The lesson came through a business situation that could have been disastrous, but instead became a testament to the power of immediate, honest acknowledgement of error. I had promised a client that I could deliver a customized training program for his sales team within 2 weeks. In my enthusiasm to win the business, I had seriously underestimated the time required to develop the materials properly. 3 days before the deadline, I realized there was no way I could deliver the quality program I had promised without significantly more time. My first instinct was to find ways to stretch the timeline without explicitly admitting my error. Suggests that we had discovered additional opportunities for improvement that required more development time, or blame unforeseen complications that had arisen. But I remembered my own teachings about the power of honest mistake admission. Instead, I picked up the phone immediately and called my client directly. "Mr. Patterson," I said, "I need to tell you that I made a significant error in judgment. When I promised to deliver your program in 2 weeks, I seriously underestimated the time required to create the quality of training your team deserves. I was wrong, and I apologize. I can deliver a mediocre program on time, or I can deliver the excellent program you deserve in 4 weeks. The choice is yours, and I understand if you decide to work with someone else. The response surprised me completely. Instead of anger or disappointment, Mr. Patterson said, "Dale, I appreciate your honesty more than you know. Most vendors would have delivered something substandard and made excuses afterward. The fact that you're willing to admit your mistake and prioritize quality tells me I made the right choice in hiring you. Take the extra time we want the excellent program." This experience taught me that quick, complete admission of mistakes often transforms potential disasters into relationships, strengthening opportunities. When you admit errors immediately and take full responsibility, you demonstrate integrity, professionalism, and genuine concern for the other person's interests. I developed a specific approach for admitting mistakes that maximized the positive impact. First, I learned to contact the affected parties immediately, before they discovered the problem themselves. Second, I took complete responsibility without making excuses or shifting blame. Third, I focused on solutions rather than dwelling on the error. Fourth, I looked for ways to make the situation right that went beyond simply fixing the mistake. In Mr. Patterson's case, I not only delivered an excellent program in 4 weeks, but included additional materials and follow-up sessions at no extra charge. He became one of my best clients and referred numerous other businesses to me, often specifically mentioning my integrity and reliability. I discovered that people's reaction to mistakes often depends more on how you handle them than on the mistakes themselves. A small error handled poorly can destroy trust and relationships, but even significant mistakes handled with immediate honesty and genuine effort to make things right can actually increase trust and respect. The psychological principle at work is powerful. When you admit mistakes quickly and sincerely, you disarm criticism and demonstrate character traits people value highly: honesty, humility, and accountability. You also show that you prioritize the relationship and the other person's interests over your own ego or convenience. I began teaching this principle to my students through personal examples and role-playing exercises. I would have them practice admitting various types of mistakes quickly and sincerely, helping them overcome the natural tendency to defend, excuse, or minimize errors. The key elements I identified for effective mistake admission were speed, contact, affected parties immediately, completeness, take full responsibility without hedging, sincerity, genuine remorse and concern, and action, immediate focus on solutions and making things right. This approach required significant personal growth. I had to overcome my ego's resistance to admitting imperfection and my fear that honesty would damage my reputation. Instead, I found that quick, honest mistake admission actually enhanced my reputation and strengthened my relationships. People began to trust me more, not less, when they saw that I would acknowledge errors immediately. They knew that if I said something was going well, I meant it, because they had evidence that I would tell them quickly if something was going wrong. The ultimate lesson was that mistakes are inevitable, but how you handle them defines your character and determines whether they damage or strengthen your relationships with others. I learned through painful experience that the first few moments of any interaction often determine the entire outcome. How you begin a conversation, especially a potentially difficult one, sets the emotional tone for everything that follows. This principle became crystal clear during a challenging situation with a landlord who was threatening to evict me over what I believed was an unfair rent increase. My initial plan was to march into his office and present a logical argument about why the increase was unreasonable, backed by comparable rent prices in the area. I was prepared to fight fire with fire, to match his aggressive stance with my own firm position. Fortunately, I paused to consider how this approach might actually work out. Instead of beginning with confrontation, I decided to start our meeting in a genuinely friendly way. When I entered his office, instead of immediately launching into my complaints, I noticed a photograph on his desk of a beautiful garden. I commented sincerely on how impressive the garden looked and asked if he had grown it himself. His entire demeanor changed. For the next 10 minutes, this man, who had seemed so stern and unreasonable, shared his passion for gardening with genuine enthusiasm. He showed me other photos, told me about his prize-winning roses, and even mentioned how he used gardening to relax after stressful days of property management. By the time we turned to discuss the rent situation, we were no longer adversaries, but two people who had found common ground. The conversation that followed was entirely different from what it would have been if I had begun with confrontation. We worked out a reasonable compromise that satisfied both of us, and he even offered to show me his garden sometime. This experience taught me that beginning in a friendly way isn't just about being polite. It's about creating an emotional environment where positive outcomes become possible. When you start with warmth, interest, and genuine friendliness, you invite the other person to respond in kind. I began experimenting with this principle in various challenging situations. When I needed to address a problem with a student's disruptive behavior, instead of beginning with criticism, I started by acknowledging something positive about their participation or insights. When I had to negotiate contract terms with clients, I began our meetings by asking about their business goals and expressing genuine interest in their success. The results were consistently remarkable. People who might have been defensive or hostile in response to immediate criticism became collaborative and open when the conversation began with warmth and genuine interest in their perspective. I discovered that friendly beginnings work because they trigger positive emotional responses that influence the entire interaction. When someone feels welcomed, appreciated, and respected from the start, they're much more likely to approach the conversation with goodwill rather than defensiveness. The key insight was that you have enormous control over how any interaction unfolds simply by choosing how to begin it. You can set a tone of confrontation, indifference, or warmth, and the other person will almost always respond accordingly. I developed a practice of consciously choosing my opening approach before entering any potentially difficult conversation. I would identify something genuine I could appreciate about the person or their situation, prepare to express sincere interest in their perspective, and commit to beginning with warmth, regardless of my own frustration or concerns. This approach proved especially valuable in business situations. When clients had complaints, or when colleagues disagreed with my recommendations, beginning our discussions with genuine appreciation for their concerns and perspectives created space for productive problem-solving rather than defensive arguing. I also learned that friendly beginnings must be authentic. People can sense the difference between genuine warmth and manipulative pleasantries. The friendliness needs to come from real appreciation for the other person as a human being, and genuine interest in finding solutions that work for everyone involved. Perhaps, most surprisingly, I found that beginning interactions in a friendly way actually changed how I felt about potentially difficult conversations. Instead of dreading confrontations, I began to see challenging discussions as opportunities to connect with people and find creative solutions to problems. The principle taught me that we often get what we expect from people. If you expect hostility and begin interactions defensively, you're likely to encounter hostility. But if you expect goodwill and begin with genuine friendliness, you create conditions where goodwill can flourish. This simple change in approach, consciously choosing to begin every interaction in a genuinely friendly way, transformed my ability to navigate difficult situations and build positive relationships even under challenging circumstances. One of the most powerful psychological principles I discovered was the momentum created by agreement. Once people begin saying yes to you, they become psychologically predisposed to continue agreeing. This principle emerged through my observation of successful salespeople and negotiators, but it applies to every type of human interaction. The revelation came while watching a master salesman named Frank Wilson demonstrate his technique to my business class. Instead of immediately presenting his product and asking for a purchase decision, Frank began with a series of questions designed to get small agreements. You'd like to save money on your monthly expenses, wouldn't you? Yes. And you want products that are reliable and well made? Yes. You prefer dealing with companies that stand behind their guarantees? Yes. By the time Frank presented his actual product, the potential customer had already established a pattern of agreement with him. When he finally asked for the sale, it felt like a natural continuation of their collaborative conversation rather than a confrontational moment where the customer had to choose sides. I began experimenting with this principle in my own interactions, starting with my teaching. Instead of beginning classes by explaining what students needed to improve, I would start with questions that got them agreeing with positive principles. Would you like to feel more confident when you speak in public? Yes. Do you believe that good communication skills can help your career? Yes. Are you willing to practice techniques that have helped thousands of other people overcome their speaking fears? Yes. This approach created an entirely different classroom dynamic. Students who had been reluctant or skeptical became collaborative partners in their own learning. They had mentally committed to the value of what we were doing before we even began the actual instruction. I discovered that the yes principle works. Because of a fundamental aspect of human psychology, we have a deep desire to be consistent with our previous statements and commitments. Once someone has agreed with you on related points, disagreeing with your main request would make them feel inconsistent with themselves. But I learned that this technique must be used ethically and authentically. The preliminary questions must be genuinely related to your eventual request, and the agreements you seek must be ones that truly serve the other person's interests. Using this principle to manipulate people into decisions that aren't in their best interest is not only wrong but ultimately counterproductive. I began using this approach in business negotiations with remarkable results. When discussing speaking engagements with potential clients, instead of immediately talking about my fees and requirements, I would start with questions about their goals. You want your employees to be more confident and effective communicators. Yes. You believe that improved communication skills would benefit your organization. Yes. You're looking for practical training that people can apply immediately. Yes. By the time we discussed specific arrangements, we had already established that we shared the same objectives. The conversation became about how to achieve our mutual goals rather than whether they should hire me. I also discovered that the principle works in reverse. Getting people to say no repeatedly makes them more likely to continue saying no. This taught me to be very careful about how I framed initial questions and requests. Starting with questions that might trigger disagreement could create negative momentum that was difficult to overcome. The technique requires careful preparation. Before any important conversation, I would identify the key agreements I needed and craft questions that would naturally lead to those agreements. The questions had to be honest and the agreements genuine. I wasn't trying to trick people, but rather to help them recognize that we shared common ground and objectives. I found this approach particularly effective when addressing resistance or skepticism. Instead of arguing against someone's doubts, I would find aspects of their concerns that I could honestly agree with, building positive momentum before addressing the areas where we differed. One memorable example involved a corporate client who was initially skeptical about public speaking training for his technical staff. Instead of defending my methods, I said, "You're right that technical people need practical, logical approaches to learning new skills. Yes, and you want training that focuses on real business communication rather than theatrical performance. Yes, You need results that directly improve their effectiveness in meetings and presentations. Yes, by the time I explained my approach, he was predisposed to see how it aligned with the principles he had already agreed were important. The training contract became a collaboration rather than a sales battle. The ultimate lesson was that influence flows more naturally from agreement than from argument. When you take the time to build genuine consensus on shared principles and goals, your eventual requests feel like logical extensions of what you've already established together. Perhaps the most counterintuitive discovery I made about becoming popular and well-liked was this: the less I talked, the more interesting people found me. This revelation came through an embarrassing experience at a cocktail party where I learned that my eagerness to share my own thoughts and experiences was actually pushing people away. I was at a gathering of influential business leaders, excited about the opportunity to make connections and share my ideas about human relations. I spent the evening moving from group to group, enthusiastically explaining my theories, sharing success stories from my classes, and offering insights about communication and leadership. I thought I was making a wonderful impression with my knowledge and expertise. Near the end of the evening, I overheard two people discussing the party. One said to the other, "That Carnegie fellow certainly has a lot to say about himself, doesn't he?" I couldn't get a word in edgewise. The comment hit me like a physical blow. In my eagerness to appear knowledgeable and engaging, I had monopolized conversations and made others feel unheard and unimportant. That humbling experience led me to completely rethink my approach to conversation. The next week, I attended a similar business gathering, but with a radically different strategy. Instead of preparing brilliant things to say, I prepared thoughtful questions to ask. Instead of looking for opportunities to share my expertise, I looked for opportunities to learn about others' experiences and insights. The transformation was remarkable. When I asked a successful manufacturer about the challenges he faced in his industry and then listened attentively to his response, he became animated and engaged. When I followed up with genuine questions about his innovations and strategies, he shared insights I never would have learned if I had been talking about my own work. By the end of that evening, 3 people approached me to continue conversations. We had started, 2 invited me to lunch, and 1 asked if I would be interested in speaking to his company. The fascinating part was that I had said perhaps 20% of what I had spoken the previous week. Yet people found me far more interesting and engaging. This experience taught me a fundamental truth about human nature. Most people would rather talk than listen, and they will like you more for giving them the opportunity to share their thoughts and experiences than for entertaining them with your own stories. I began practicing what I called strategic silence in my daily interactions. In business meetings, instead of immediately offering my opinions, I would ask questions and listen carefully to others' perspectives before contributing. In social situations, I would focus on drawing others out rather than performing for them. The results were consistently positive. People began seeking me out for conversations, not because I was entertaining them, but because I made them feel heard and valued. They would leave our interactions feeling energized and appreciated, and they associated those positive feelings with me. I discovered that effective listening requires active engagement, not passive silence. When someone shared an experience, I would ask follow-up questions that showed I was genuinely interested. How did you feel when that happened? What did you learn from that experience? What would you do differently if you faced a similar situation? This approach revealed fascinating insights about people that I never would have discovered through normal conversation. The reserved accountant had profound thoughts about life and purpose. The businessman, who seemed focused only on profits, was deeply committed to creating jobs in his community. The society matron, who appeared superficial, had overcome significant personal challenges with remarkable courage, I learned that most people are starving for someone to truly listen to them. In their daily lives, they encounter people who are waiting for their turn to speak, people who are distracted by their own concerns, people who listen only long enough to find an opening to share their own experiences. When you give someone the gift of complete attention and genuine interest in their thoughts and experiences, you provide something rare and precious. The principle worked in every context. In business negotiations, letting the other party talk first revealed their real priorities and concerns, making it easier to find solutions that satisfied everyone. In teaching, encouraging students to share their experiences and challenges created more engaging and effective learning environments. Perhaps most importantly, I discovered that by talking less and listening more, I actually learned more, understood people better, and became genuinely more interesting because of the insights and perspectives I gained from others. One of the most powerful techniques I learned for influencing people was the art of planting ideas so skillfully that others believed they had thought of them themselves. This principle emerged from watching how people responded to suggestions versus how they responded to their own ideas, and the difference was dramatic. The lesson crystallized during a challenging situation with my assistant, Margaret, who was struggling with organizing our growing correspondence and student records. I had developed what I thought was an excellent filing system that would solve our problems, but when I presented it to her directly, she resisted the change, pointing out several potential complications and expressing doubt about whether it would really improve efficiency. Frustrated by her resistance to what seemed like an obviously better approach, I was tempted to simply insist on implementing my system. But something made me pause and try a different strategy. Instead of pushing my solution, I began asking Margaret questions about the problems we were facing and what she thought might help. Margaret, you've mentioned that finding old correspondence takes too much time. What do you think might help us locate letters more quickly? I asked. She suggested organizing by date, which was part of my system. That's an excellent idea, I said genuinely. And what about student records? How might we organize those more efficiently? She proposed grouping them by class session, another element of my approach, over the course of several conversations. Through careful questions and encouragement, Margaret essentially recreated my filing system piece by piece. But now it was her system, incorporating her ideas and addressing her concerns. The difference in her enthusiasm for implementing it was remarkable. She worked on it eagerly, refined it with improvements I hadn't considered, and took pride in showing others how well it worked. This experience taught me that people have much more confidence in ideas they believe they've developed themselves. When you force your ideas on others, even good ideas, you trigger their natural resistance to being controlled or directed. But when you guide them to discover the same insights through their own thinking, they embrace those ideas with enthusiasm. I began practicing this technique in my teaching. Instead of simply lecturing about public speaking principles, I would ask students questions that led them to discover those principles themselves. What do you think makes one speaker more engaging than another? When you listen to someone speak, what makes you want to pay attention? What happens to your own confidence when you're well prepared versus unprepared? Through this Socratic approach, students would arrive at the same insights I wanted to teach, but they owned those insights in a way they never owned information simply delivered to them. They applied the principles more consistently because they believed in them more deeply. I discovered that this technique required patience and skill. You couldn't simply lead people to predetermined conclusions. You had to genuinely engage with their thinking process and be prepared to incorporate their genuine insights into the final outcome. Sometimes their ideas improved on my original concepts in ways I hadn't anticipated. In business situations, I found this approach invaluable for gaining buy-in for new initiatives. Instead of presenting complete proposals, I would outline challenges, and opportunities, then facilitate discussions where stakeholders could develop solutions collaboratively. The solutions that emerged were often better than my original ideas, and everyone felt invested in making them work. One memorable example involved convincing a client to expand his employee training program. Rather than arguing for the benefits of additional training, I asked him what he observed about the performance differences between his most and least effective employees. Through our conversation, he identified that communication skills were the key differentiator. When I asked what might help bridge that gap, he suggested expanded training programs that went far beyond what I had originally planned to propose. The psychological principle at work is fundamental. People support what they help create. When someone feels they've contributed to developing an idea or solution, they have ego investment in seeing it succeed. They become advocates rather than reluctant participants. I learned to plant seeds of ideas through questions, stories, and observations, then give others space and time to develop those seeds into their own insights. The key was genuine patience, allowing the natural thinking process to unfold, rather than rushing to reveal my preferred conclusions. This approach also taught me intellectual humility. By involving others in developing ideas rather than simply presenting my own, I often discovered perspectives and improvements I would have missed on my own. The collaborative process consistently produced better outcomes than my individual thinking. The ultimate lesson was that influence isn't about imposing your will on others. It's about helping them discover wisdom and solutions for themselves. When you master this art, people don't just comply with your suggestions. They enthusiastically champion ideas they believe they helped create. As I reflect on decades of studying human nature and teaching these principles to thousands of people, I'm struck by how timeless these truths really are. Technology may change, business practices may evolve, and social customs may shift, but the fundamental human needs for appreciation, respect, and genuine connection remain constant. When I began this journey as that shy farm boy from Missouri, I never imagined that understanding human relations would become my life's work. I thought success meant being the smartest person in the room, the most eloquent speaker, or the most impressive personality. I learned instead that true success in human relations comes from making others feel smart, heard, and valued. The principles I've shared with you aren't theoretical concepts, they're practical tools I've tested in thousands of real-world situations. I've seen them transform marriages, advance careers, build businesses, and create lasting friendships. More importantly, I've seen them change the people who practice them, making them not just more successful, but genuinely happier and more fulfilled. In today's world, where people are more connected, yet often feel more isolated than ever, these principles are perhaps more relevant than they were in my time. Social media and digital communication can make it easier to broadcast your thoughts, but harder to truly listen to others. The pace of modern life can make genuine interest in others feel like a luxury rather than a necessity, but I believe this makes authentic human connection even more powerful and rare. In a world full of people trying to get attention, the person who gives attention stands out dramatically. In an environment where most communication is hurried and superficial, someone who takes time to really listen and understand becomes extraordinarily valuable. The key insight that has guided my entire approach is this: you can be more successful in 2 months by becoming genuinely interested in other people than you can in 2 years by trying to get other people interested in you. This isn't just a strategy, it's a fundamental shift in how you view relationships and success. I've watched people apply these principles in modern contexts with remarkable results. The executive who remembers the names and interests of everyone in his organization, from senior managers to janitors, creates loyalty and enthusiasm that no salary or benefits package could match. The salesperson who focuses on understanding customers, real needs rather than pushing products builds. Relationships that generate referrals for decades. The parent who listens to their children with genuine interest and respect, even when they disagree with their opinions, maintains close relationships through teenage years and beyond. The teacher who makes each student feel capable and important creates learning environments where people flourish rather than just comply. These principles work because they're based on unchanging aspects of human nature. Every person, regardless of age, background, or status, wants to feel important, understood, and appreciated. When you consistently provide these experiences for others, you become someone they want to be around, work with, and support. But remember, these techniques only work when they come from genuine care and respect for others. If you try to use them as manipulation tactics to get what you want without truly caring about others' well-being, people will sense the insincerity and your efforts will backfire. The real transformation happens when you begin to genuinely enjoy other people, when you become truly curious about their experiences and perspectives, when you find satisfaction in helping them feel valued and successful. This isn't just about becoming more likable. It's about becoming a better human being. My challenge to you is this: choose one of these principles and practice it consistently for the next week. Notice how people respond to you differently. Pay attention to how you feel when you focus on making others feel important rather than trying to prove your own importance. Start with something simple. Remember and use people's names. Listen more than you talk, or look for genuine things to appreciate about others. These small changes in behavior can create remarkable changes in your relationships and opportunities. The principles I've shared aren't magic formulas, they're disciplines that require practice and genuine commitment to others' well-being. But when you master them, you'll discover what I learned decades ago. The secret to being liked isn't about becoming someone different. It's about bringing out the best in everyone you meet. In a world that often seems to reward self-promotion and aggressive competition, I invite you to try a different approach. Act as if everyone already likes you by treating them with the warmth, respect, and genuine interest that creates the very reality you're assuming. You might be amazed at how quickly that assumption becomes truth.